Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm back with another book review, and today we're looking at The Waking Nightmares by M.D. Boncher. I apologize if I butchered that last name. I'm not quite sure if I pronounced it correctly. The Waking Nightmares is part of an ongoing series called Tales from the Dream Nebula. It is also the third book in the series. Now, I haven't read the other books in the series for reasons that I'll get to in a minute. Just for now, know that this is part of an ongoing series and not the first part. I don't think I'm going to be spoiling any of the other parts of the story here, but if you want to be absolutely sure, well, I'll try and keep discussion of any elements that could be spoilery to a later part of the video, which I will call out when we get there. Now, the Dream Nebula is an interesting blend of hard sci-fi and fantasy. Earth has been destroyed by some kind of invading conqueror, and it's not entirely clear whether Xiao, the Conqueror, is an extra-dimensional entity, some kind of super powerful entity from outside the solar system, or some kind of ascended human who has unlocked some kind of extremely powerful technology that no other part of Earth could match. What we do know is that he's conquered the solar system, destroyed Earth, and locked humanity in suspended animation for a time. Or at least that's what I know. I've only read The Waking Nightmares, and that's about all the context we get in that particular book. But it's enough to go on. Xiao doesn't seem to be a very relevant character, at least to this particular story. And having him just cast an ominous shadow in the background, I think, is fine. Before I get too deep into the ins and outs of the story itself, let me mention why I'm reviewing the third book in the series. That is because I was a test reader for this book while it was in its editing process, and the author offered me an advanced reader copy to do a review from. Now, I only know Boncher in a very casual sense. I think he has a decent command of prose, but I wouldn't say I've worked with him as closely as someone like Narwhal. But this is a project I've contributed to, as well as one that I am reviewing, so keep that in mind as you listen to this review. I also chose not to go back and take in the entirety of the series up until this point because I think it's important that each work should be able to stand on its own to a certain degree. And I like to go into some of these series in the middle just to see how well an author that is asking for feedback does on that particular aspect of it. So, right off the bat, if you're just looking for a quick story that you can jump into in the middle of an ongoing story and get a sense of what the story is like before you go back and commit yourself to 3 whole books worth of reading, let me tell you that you absolutely can, and that's an impressive achievement in and of itself. Sci-fi and fantasy in particular, as a genre, has a tendency to build up a lot of concepts that readers have to keep in mind. And I think Boncher does a pretty good job of juggling those concepts in such a way that a new reader can pick up this book and get a sense of what his world is like and what the adventures in it are like without having to commit to picking up all of that lore from the very beginning. That, in and of itself, is a praiseworthy accomplishment for a writer. So, with that said, if you choose to jump into the Dream Nebula series with The Waking Nightmares, what kind of story are you going to get? Well, it's a bit of an adventure tale, but it's not a big sweeping adventure. It is an adventure of suspense and excitement in a single place. There is a bit of some of those classic sci-fi horror movies like Alien mixed in here. Our protagonists, Winston and Bubby, who are kind of interplanetary truckers, have their spaceship undergoing repairs, and they are stuck in a single location with a new patron, the Yunkers. Or the Junkers. I'm not sure which way these sci-fi people pronounce their J's. I'm going to assume Yunkers, because they're an aristocratic family, and that's the way I think aristocratic Europeans would say it. It's just a guess. Anyway, the Yunkers are fancy, important people, and fancy, important people have fancy, important problems. Like sometimes people try to assassinate them by smuggling in packages with exotic alien flesh-devouring life forms in them. Yes, that is the basic premise of the book. It's pretty exciting. I'm not gonna lie. I'm a sucker for a story where you have a new kind of monster show up and you have to figure out what it does by analyzing the monster and coming up with a solution. There's a fair amount of that going on in this story. There's also an exploration of some bigger themes here. Winston and Bubby used to work for an advanced artificial intelligence called Mother Road. something has happened to this AI in a previous adventure, and they no longer have that resource at their disposal. So figuring out what they're going to do about that is also a sub-theme in this novel. I think, in particular, the aspect of this AI's legacy and the way it is handled in the narrative does a very good job of handling a plot thread that could be confusing to a new reader. We get enough context to understand what is going on, and we get some hints as to where it might go in the future. But all in all, the agendas that Mother Road was trying to play out using Winston and Bubby as part of her plan is mostly left to our imagination, and I think that's just fine. It's an intriguing thread, and it is one of the things that is most likely to get me to go back and read the rest of the series when I have the time. There are a couple of other threads that are a little harder to parse. In particular, Winston has some kind of a relationship with a femme fatale character. It's heavily implied that this femme fatale has used some kind of technology to get leverage over Winston. But there's also some implications of some kind of emotional connection between Winston and this femme fatale. Parsing that, the character dynamics there, how much was technology and how much was an actual relationship between the two, not necessarily romantic. Winston is kind of hung up over the death of his wife, and that also adds a strange emotional wrinkle to this as well, as does the fact that he has a computer-generated replica of his wife that he visits at times. All of these emotional threads that seem to define this relationship are a little harder to parse out, and it's not immediately important to the story, so I think that would be okay. Except, there is one major story impact this has, but in order to discuss it, I am going to have to get a little bit into spoilers. So, if you want a recommendation for whether I think The Waking Nightmares is worth your time, I would certainly recommend picking it up digitally if you like sci-fi adventure stories with maybe a bit of a horror twist. Give it a look, see if the Dream Nebula series is something that appeals to you. Now, if you really geek out at that kind of Flash Gordon-esque era, adventure laser gun kind of a story, then maybe you just want to pick up the whole series, because that really feels like what we have here. A working class Joe in a unfathomably powerful empire that has done incredible damage to his life and to Earth, and is just trying to sort it all out. That is the kind of story that it looks like Boncher is trying to tell, and I think he's doing a really good job of it. His creature design is excellent. I found the monster very fascinating, and untangling all the little bits and pieces of it was very fun. His action scenes are very easy to understand and parse what's going on, which I think is really important in this kind of swashbuckling adventure story. And his protagonist is a likable woebegone character who manages not to tip over the line into just being a sad sack. Winston is fun to follow around, and his partnership with Bubby is also pretty entertaining. But let's talk about that one part that involves a few spoilers. In a previous story, Winston nearly died, and he was saved by Amanda Junker, his new patron. However, as Amanda was treating his injuries, she also added some programming to Winston's body. And this is apparently a thing that can happen in the Dream Nebula. You can have things like personality adjustments or training to use firearms or fight hand-to-hand, just added to your brain. Now, Winston is very wary of this, and part of the reason he is wary of this is because this femme fatale character, whose name is Holly, used similar technology to manipulate his emotions. And it's hard to get a good read on Winston's reaction to Amanda's tampering without the context of exactly what Holly did to him in the previous stories. None of these things are ever brought up. I mean, we know that Holly manipulated him, but what kind of manipulation is, I think, important context for this kind of character beat, and we don't really get a lot of it. And this is, I think, the one spot where the character work could be a little bit better. It's a delicate issue, and some feedback was given to Boncher about this. I think he took most of it to heart and implemented it in... And I should take a moment here to say that having read the beta version and the ARC version, it can be kind of hard to keep them separate, but I believe there were at least a couple of spots where I saw places where things had been rewritten in a way that made them better. So he was clearly working very hard on this. I hadn't even thought of this aspect of the story until I was reading it through a second time. And while I think it would be illuminating to have some more of that context, I don't think it undermines the character beat too much. In fact, it's a very, very minor thing. Just something I think that's worth saying. I did find it a bit odd that there were so few specifics given, because typically when you have that kind of emotional shock, it's rooted in something very specific, and when you're distraught about it, as Winston is in this story, you tend to throw it in the face of whoever is agitating you. So it's a small beat that could have been better. It's really not a big deal, but I feel like for the sake of being thorough, I should mention it. And honestly, since I was a test reader for this and I didn't catch it the first time, it is at least partly on me. Because I think if it had occurred to me at the time, Boncher probably would have made a good faith effort to improve that particular story beat. And this is why it can be tough to offer a clear-sighted review of a book you've already offered feedback on in the editing process. I honestly am not sure that this is the best way to go about it, but I think Boncher made a good faith effort to write the best thing he can, and I am now offering a good faith effort to give the best review I can. Hopefully, you have found it useful. Let me know if you've read this series, what you think of it, down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.